Hello again. Just wanted to take a few moments and give some responses to some of the comments that came up frequently in the discussion of the module about eggs and the monks and their conflict with PETA. And a lot of you had some really good, balanced assessments of the situation. A lot of people were torn on really who to side with because most people saw the conditions as problematic, but they also tended to see the tactics of PETA as problematic as well. And so it is a complicated situation where it's not clear that there is any one group that really is kind of wholly and completely in the right or wholly and completely in the wrong. But there were a few things that came up again on multiple groups that I thought might be helpful to comment on, particularly again as you are thinking about and working on some similar issues in many cases for your final paper. So a few things to mention, and one of the first and probably most important is the question of whether the battery cage approach is necessary in order to feed the people of our country, feed the people of the world, or whether it is important in terms of providing more affordable eggs that would be affordable for the poorer members of our society. And that came up in, I think, most of the groups in one form or another. And so I think those are valid issues to raise. That if if we turned around tomorrow and the only eggs available in stores were those truly produced from humane environments where animals had a significant amount of freedom and ability to kind of carry out their natural behaviors, those eggs would be exceptionally expensive and much more expensive than the current offerings. So I think that is a valid concern. We certainly wouldn't be able to make an immediate switch. On the other hand, though, I think if you look at this in terms of individual consumers or individual producers, we do seem to face that dilemma. But I think if we step back and look at this as a societal choice, it's a little different, right? That if you reflect on some of the material we've talked about in the course, in terms of what percentage of our nation's economy is devoted to food, it is the smallest percentage of any major society in world history, right? That as a society, we have decided to devote most of our resources to other things, right? And so in our current social setup, the only way to produce enough affordable eggs is using these methods which seem to violate the nature of chickens and other animals as God's creatures and not just production machines. There would be other ways, I think, of organizing our society so that we spent more of our collective resources on producing our food in ways that would make that food still accessible to poorer people in our society. That would, though, require, of course, a sacrifice of some of those other resources, other parts of the economy that we currently give those resources, give that labor to, right? So it might mean fewer consumer goods of various types or fewer services of various types in order to focus more on producing large quantities of good, affordable food. So again, if the only options in our current model were the ones that are organic and free range, that wouldn't be affordable for the poor. But I think there are other ways we could go about producing food in our country that could still meet those needs and still be more humane in the production methods. So another comment that came up frequently in the discussions was a criticism of PETA's tactics and the tactics of animal rights activists in terms of sneaking in and getting videos which were then used in the attack on the monks and their egg production. And so the sneaking in, again, I think you could argue that that is not moral, although they would argue, right, that there's no legitimate way to get the footage, so they did what they had to do. But I do think it's worth pointing out it is something that we would have to think about whether or not it is moral, although there are lots of times where government officials or investigative reporters will go undercover in order to get information that can't be acquired any other way. And I don't think all of those cases are therefore immoral. But the other factor to consider in this case is, and this is not just in connection with egg production, but in lots of large-scale agricultural production today, manufacturers and producers will not allow you to go in and see the conditions. And in fact, in many states, including in Kansas, laws have been passed that specifically forbid people from photographing or videotaping the operations at feedlots or egg laying facilities or places like this. So we could say, well, they shouldn't have lied and snuck in. On the other hand, there is no other way in many cases to find out the conditions of the animals. And I think it certainly raises the question of why do they go so far out of their way to prevent people from seeing the sources of their food, which strikes me as problematic in terms of consumer rights, and certainly runs very counter to the vision of food production that Wurzba talks about, for example, in his books, right? That this distancing from the food production is exactly part of the problem, and a refusal to allow people to see where their food comes from is just raising that to another level of problematic production. So that was something I wanted to make sure to mention. A couple other issues, again, that came up on most of the group's discussions was people would say, well, the monk's production is okay because it met industry standards. And I'm pretty certain I mentioned this on the module, but if not, or just to reiterate, right, the fact that industry standards are met doesn't make something ethical, right? And we ought to be very skeptical, I think critical, of industry's attempts to legislate and to police themselves, right? There's just too much built-in incentive for compromising for the sake of profit when industries or companies are allowed to set their own standards, right? So the fact that industry standards are met doesn't ensure that the treatment is humane or that the treatment is moral, right? We can point to lots of examples from history where governments or companies have done things that have met standards, but are then obviously still clearly immoral. So that's something to keep in mind. On the other hand, or on the other side of the coin, if you will, we do want to also be careful about, well, a number of people made arguments to the effect of it's not right to keep these chickens in such tight quarters because if we kept people in conditions like this, we would see it as obviously wrong. And I understand the line of thinking there, but we need to be careful, at least in Catholic thinking and in natural law, of equating human beings and animals, right? That human beings have an intrinsic dignity such that they can never be treated as a means to an end or as a what instead of a who, whereas animals are not. They don't have that same intrinsic dignity. Now, we need to treat them as creatures and not just as objects or production modules, if you will. So we need to treat them humanely. We need to take their suffering and their nature as creatures into consideration when we're making decisions. But just because we wouldn't treat a human being in a particular way doesn't make it immoral to treat an animal that way. Right? Obviously, we can, for example, kill and eat animals according to natural law, which obviously we can't do with people. And this also ties back in with the comments about selective breeding or artificial insemination from the Comkin reading. Again, those are things that most natural law theorists would see as morally permissible for animals, but obviously not morally permissible when it comes to people. So we need to keep that in mind. And then just lastly, a lot of people suggested, well, why don't the monks just make some smaller changes, right? Why do they have to stop operations? Why can't they just give them a little more room, or why can't they let them out sometimes during the day? And just, again, we don't need to get into lots of details on this, but making those kinds of changes would be very difficult on a larger scale, right? So that letting the chickens out of the cages, for example, would be a nightmare in terms of trying to get them out and then trying to get them back in. Or modifying the cages, modifying the equipment, and all of that could be just extraordinarily expensive. And in agriculture, the profit margins are usually very thin, very small. And so doing significant overhaul of the production facility probably would have been economically impossible in terms of supporting this community using the eggs. And frankly, of course, it's also likely in their situation that whatever changes they made would have been viewed as insufficient. They would have had to keep fighting this battle, and so they simply chose to go with a different way of supporting themselves. So it's worth thinking about. Maybe there are some small changes we can make in some of these industries, like egg production. But when you try to do that on a larger scale, what seems like small changes could often, in many cases, be just very expensive to actually implement. So that's something to keep in mind as you are looking at critiques of different restaurants or different agricultural industries and looking at the industry responses. A lot of times they will point out the expenses, and that's in many cases a legitimate concern on their part. So those were just some of the things that came up in lots of the discussion groups. Again, I think you all did a nice job of looking at this issue. If you have any questions or you want to talk about any of that further, please just go ahead and reply on the discussion board. Thanks.